There we go. Perfect. Okay. So the purpose of today's event is to bring people together who are working towards a Scotland where everyone can afford the food that keeps them healthy and well. We wanted to share what we've been doing and learning through the Our Right to Food project, and we plan to take some time today to reflect together about what this approach means for our understanding about the right to food in Scotland and how we can use this learning to take steps at national and local levels. So here's just a little bit of a breakdown about what we'll be doing today. I'll be giving a little bit of an overview of what we've learned together. We'll hear from the Scottish Government Diet and Healthy Weight team, and Peter Fassenderher has thankfully stepped in for the minister who was unfortunately unable to join us today. We'll then have opportunities after both of those for questions and answers and a small group discussion before the break. After the break, we'll be responding to a few points that came up during your discussions and thinking about how we take this work forward at national and local levels. And we've got Louise here from the Scottish Human Rights Commission, who's going to tell us a little bit about what is happening at national level here in Scotland in terms of the opportunities we have. So since we have participants both online and in the room today, we're going to be using Mentimeter to share the conversation. So even though many of you are here and could easily just shout out your questions or comments throughout the day, I'd really encourage you to get on your phones, get on Mentimeter so that we can all be speaking to the same, collecting our comments, reflections, key points in the same space. So can I ask everybody, whether you're online or in person, to get out your phones or a tab in your browser, go to menti.com and type in the following code. For those of you online, Simon might be giving you a direct link. That would be brilliant. For those of you in the room, if you've got a phone, go ahead and find it yourself. If there's somebody next to you who seems to be struggling, you should have the opportunity to be able to go through a couple questions at a time. So we wanted to first of all know where you are based. Where are you based ordinarily? Where is the work that you do based? So I'm sorry? Okay, that's okay. So this first question is where are you or your work based? So the code, you need the code again. And it's right at yep, it's at the top. You should be able to see it. Can you find a friend on your table who's able to type in for you as well? So we've got people working right across Scotland, people from Edinburgh, people from Argyll and Bute, Perth and Kinross, Northern Ireland, Dundee, Forth Valley, Lanarkshire. Lovely. Brilliant to see so many people from so many different Sutherland, long distances traveled. That Sutherland is not coming in online. That was coming to us live in person. So Fife, brilliant. That's excellent. Okay, so next question is, what kind of work do you do? Can we switch on to the next slide? Oops. So where do you work or you volunteer? Who do we have in the room with us? So a lot of voluntary civil society, some universities, some community groups, a couple of people from Scottish Government, some public agencies, probably Public Health Scotland. Excellent. So you can keep populating that and we'll get a bit of a idea of how many people are coming from different sectors. And then the final question for the moment, while we all get practiced at Menti, is just a little bit of how often are you using human rights in the work that you're doing day to day? Do you think about human rights in your work every day, sometimes, rarely? Are you confident about what the right to food means? Would you be able to describe it to somebody else, do you think? And finally, do you think Scotland is taking positive steps to promote the right to food? Just let a few more of those answers come in. Thanks everybody for joining us in this online space. We have a lot of people who are doing a lot of human rights work, it looks like, which is brilliant. Excellent. Okay, thank you so very much. So that was just to get us a little bit practiced. Throughout the rest of the session, there will be opportunities for you to put key points, questions, comments into the Menti in the same way that you've just done, but you can type in as many as you want. And that's how we'll be doing most of our Q&A so that we can involve people online and those of us in the room. So next, we are very pleased to be able to have a video message from the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. Michael Fakhri was not able to join us in person or online at this time because he's based in Oregon, but he has very gratefully, or we are very grateful to him for sending us a video message. So as you'll hear in the video, Professor Fakhri is an expert on the right to food and advises the United Nations. He's unable to join us today because of the time difference, but Anna is about to pop up the video for us.
Hello, my name is Michael Fakhri, and I am the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. This means I'm an independent expert for the UN system. I'm the eyes, ears, and good conscience on all matters regarding hunger, malnutrition, and famine from a human rights perspective. Due to the time difference between Scotland and Oregon, I'm not able to speak to you live. I want to first congratulate people in Scotland and the Scottish government for passing the Good Food Bill. When you create laws, monitoring agencies, and a national plan around the right to food, it activates all of society and government. The Good Food Bill is great, but it is still important to make sure that the right to food is ultimately incorporated into Scots law. So now it's time to roll up your sleeves and get to work. It's time to define what the right to food means for Scotland. It's about people deciding for themselves what it means to live and eat with dignity in Scotland and not let corporations or international geopolitics determine people's access to good food. In the most general terms, the right to food means that food must always be available, accessible, and adequate for everyone. Available means that there must be a stable supply of food. Accessible means that people must be able to get and make food in a way that's fair and stable, either through markets or through access to land and waterways. Adequate means that food should be good food, culturally, ecologically, and nutritionally appropriate. Most importantly, it means that people should be able to decide for themselves what is adequate. Human rights more generally means that governments should prioritize their relationship to people. Governments should listen and respond to people. They should give people the power to determine what kind of dignified life they want to live. This brings in the values of participation, non-discrimination, equality, and accountability. This report launched today by Nourish Scotland is an excellent example of how one could go about determining what is adequate food from a human rights perspective. It shows that determining what is adequate food is the result of an ongoing conversation and process amongst people themselves and between people in the government. Food is not just a commodity. It is the result of a set of practices. It is part of the rhythm of everyday life. We give meaning to life through how and what we eat. Who we eat with establishes the bonds that create kin and community. I was really impressed by the methodology behind the report, and I think such a process could highlight the complexity and diversity of Scottish society in a way that would lead to good policy that would fulfill the right to food. So, all that being said, how can you give meaning to the right to food? I'll focus on three things. First, I think this report shows how you have to start with meeting people where they are. In nutritional terms, we should eat an abundant amount of fruits, vegetables, and fiber, and avoid ultra-processed foods because they are high in sugar, salt, and fat. If you eat meat, it shouldn't be all the time, and the less processed, the better. Okay, but what does that mean for real life? What does it mean when you're navigating a hectic day and dealing with kids, running late for work and commuting? As this report demonstrates, start from people's reality, and through a conversation, through dialogue, you can work out what it would cost to eat well. This, of course, includes sometimes eating out, indulging for celebrations when we can, doing our best with what we have. Start with figuring out the cost of what is good enough based on today's reality. This is all before we start telling people how to change what they eat. This makes the right to food concrete for a particular country at a particular time. Second, governments also need to start with existing reality. Every government in the world is facing a debt crisis, a cost of living crisis, and a broken trade regime. Despite these structural challenges, governments can still move ahead with the right to food. In my last report to the UN General Assembly, I told governments that one good thing that came out of the first 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic is that they have learned what works. So instead of treating measures that helped people and fulfilled their human rights as temporary measures, don't treat these measures as temporary. Treat them as a proof of concept and make them permanent programs. These are things like free universal school meals and direct cash payments. It's about repurposing existing budgets. My final point is that how we eat determines our relationship with the land, rivers, and ocean. The other thing I advise governments when I reported to the General Assembly is that local land policy and supporting local farmers and fishers is key to ensuring a strong, effective food policy. Even if a country needs to import a significant portion of food, supporting local producers and ensuring fair access to land and waterways is what keeps a country's relationship to the ecosystem strong and a food system resilient to climate change and political economic crisis. I wish you the best for today's session, and I look forward to further conversations with everyone in Scotland. Thanks.
Thank you so very much, Michael, for joining us even from afar. And with that as a start, I'm pleased to share a bit about the report and what it is that we've been doing. Here we go. So the starting point for the Our Right to Food project was a shared vision that many of us have of a Scotland where everyone is able to afford the food that keeps them healthy and well. We wanted to explore the affordability of a healthy diet in Scotland. The other key point to mention at the outset is that we were looking at this from a right to food perspective. We know that the right to food is about more than just nutritional content. We needed to understand what people's priorities are around what's a good fit for our lives in today's Scotland. What are our priorities around healthy eating? And what do people enjoy? So, what have we done? First, we gathered a group of experts together, a steering group to help advise us on the project, and we're very grateful for their support. Many of them are joining us from the online room today. Thank you so much for everything you've done for us. With their advice and their support, we decided to focus the project on 2 household types that are at a higher risk of food insecurity than average. These households are also priority groups for action on child poverty in Scotland. So then we recruited 4 groups of volunteer community advisors. Some of them are also online. Some of them are with us here today to help us imagine the lives of these families, the families that might live in these types of households. Community advisors were women from across Scotland who know what it's like to shop for, prepare, and share meals in small and large families today. Working together online, we met over a series of meetings throughout 2021, and we brought these families to life. We used personas to help the community advisors and project team imagine the priorities, preferences, and aspirations of all the individuals who lived in this family and the family as a whole. The families were invented, but each household was designed to be recognizable as a family who might reasonably live in Scotland today. Why did we do this? Why did we use case study families to work in this way? We wanted to involve people in a process that improved what we understood about what the right to food means by focusing on the realities, challenges, and priorities of what a specific family might need for themselves. So we spent months together working out what this family might eat in a typical week, trying to establish what their cooking and eating patterns were alongside all of the other challenges that we face day to day, trying to get to and from work and to and from school. What exactly would they eat in those patterns? And then what were their healthy aspirations? Thinking about a week when they were eating the healthiest that they wanted to eat, or what their priorities were. How could we move the family's typical diet a little bit closer towards the Eat Well guide? And then we spent quite a lot of time turning all of that way of eating into a detailed shopping list that became a way for us to monitor and measure the price and the cost over time. This approach built on the learning from the minimum income standard approach. So we really thank the steering group member, Matt, for advising us on the work that they did there, as well as Safe Foods work in Ireland and Northern Ireland on the cost of a healthy food basket. So thank you to Sinead, who's also joining us. Through all of the work, the community advisors thought about the needs, the priorities, and the preferences of the case study families. What would Kathy and Jody Robinson make on a Thursday night after they'd been working all week? What kinds of negotiations and challenges were people having with their children about eating that portion of broccoli and whether it was broccoli versus cauliflower? When would Nora Harris have the most energy and time to make a meal from scratch? And when was it just the right thing to do to have an easy night? Throughout all of this, we were keeping these three things in balance. We needed all of the foods that we wanted to include in the whole of the week to be a good fit for their lives, to be enjoyable, and to be healthy enough. And we worked together to figure out what fit within that balance and with the advice from our steering group members along the way. We did all of this to help turn our ideas about eating and cooking patterns, healthy aspirations, and personal preferences into a shopping list that we could then use as a tool. We wanted to explore what families would choose to include in their weekly diets if income from benefits and wages was sufficient. Sorry. So what have we learned about an adequate diet? The full report is available online. I think you've been given a link to it. You all will be sent a link after the event as well. You've got hard copies of our summary report, and there's many more details on the website about the different families and everything that we were exploring with them. There's a lot more detail behind this than I can share with us today, but here's a bit of what we learned. So one of the things we learned about adequate diets was that daily, weekly rhythms were seen to have a greater effect on the time and the motivation that people have to cook from scratch than kitchen skills. Kitchen skills just didn't come up in our discussions as the main motivation or the main limitation that people might face. It was all of these other things around what gets in the way. We also found that sharing meals is a highly valued way of participating in our current food culture, but that of course there are challenges to this with different preferences and different, time frames and people's lives getting in the way. But that was the aspiration, was that we were broadly sharing meals together. We learned that realizing the right to food is about being able to celebrate birthdays and afford fresh strawberries when they're in season, and that pleasure and enjoyment should not be out of reach for people simply because of their incomes. And we learned that the healthiest meal plans wouldn't meet all of the recommendations of the Eat Well Guide or the majority of the Scottish Dietary Goals. We're on a journey towards that with these lists, but they wouldn't fit within our current recommendations. And we think that's okay, because as Michael Fakhri mentioned, we need to start where people are at on the journey towards realizing the right to food. What is worth noting is that compared to the Scottish population, the adults would be eating more fruit, veg, and fiber than the average Scot, and fewer free sugars, but slightly more fat and saturated fat. It was much easier to agree things like adding fruit as a snack or sticking a couple of vegetables into a favorite family meal than it was to swap for low-fat cheese or something like that. So that's why the advisors aspirations for the family are really reflected in what the final meal plans are. So what have we learned about how accessible this is for people? Next, we wanted to know what this way of eating cost and how affordable that would be for people. Looking across each of the 4 families, we saw that there was an average increase of more than 20 pounds per week over the past year. We've been tracking the price of the shopping lists every quarter since December 2021. And as you'll see in the report today, there's plenty more detail on how much things cost and what the increases were. But when you explore some of the detail about what this increase looked like for different families, you can see that it was obviously not spread equally across different food items. And there is additional pressure that families are under on some of the foods that we would want people to be eating, and they want to be eating around fruit and vegetables, the sort of core bits of the Eat Well guide. While you can see in the sweets, chocolate crisps, and that section, there were lower increases in the time that we've been monitoring. Obviously, that would have a differential impact on people's decisions when they're trying to make difficult choices. So we also tracked how much this would be of people's disposable income. So we imagined, as we were imagining together with the community advisors, what the families would like and do and be and eat and all of those sorts of things. We also gave them jobs because, of course, we needed to understand when they were, what their shift patterns were like and how many hours the part-time workers were working and those kinds of things. So we have what it would have come down to is that the shopping list on average would be 32% of the disposable income for the families as we've sort of designed them. And this is after housing costs. Compared to average incomes in Scotland, it's pretty similar. It'd be 32% for the larger family and 30% for the single parents. So we want to also just take a moment to thank Scottish Government analyst teams who helped us work out some of these figures for us. So how do we begin to start applying some of the learning of this? So what this shows us, if we look a little bit more specifically at particular policies, is what effect the policies might be having on the ability of these families to meet the needs, to meet the costs of the diets that the groups had chosen for them. For example, we can see that extending universal free school meals to P6s and 7s would save the Browns nearly 30 pounds per month. Increasing the value of the Scottish Child Payment, as was done in November, and extending it in the way that it was done to up to 16s, provided the large families an additional 75 pounds per week. Those are significant changes to a household budget when we're looking at trying to make sure that people have the ability to afford the food that they would choose to keep them healthy and well. So it helps us to be able to put real figures against some of the numbers and policies that come out. I wanted to now just take a moment to recognize that we do have some community advisors joining us online and also in person. And Jocelyn and Amanda have very generously offered to join me here for a second. And so if you could come on up. We have a couple other members in the room as well who are have not been strong-armed into it. So I just wanted to take a minute to ask you both, you were working on different families. You weren't working in the same group, but you were meeting with us online all last year. And I wanted to hear from you. We wanted to hear from you about what you think now that you see the report. And does it reflect anything that you thought it might, based on all of the very, very detailed conversations we had about how many peppers we needed to include, how often those peppers might go bad, what we were going to do about that last bite of garlic bread and who was going to eat that, and if we were going to allocate that to dad or somebody else. And so I just wanted to, from all of that detailed, very nuanced work that we did over the course of a whole year together, just any reflections that you have.
Well, in my personal opinion, it was amazing to be part of this because as a single mom, you see daily how you struggle with the stuff, even with the what moms do and what others do, and you feel guilty about what you're doing, and it's so much pressure, but at the same time you want your kids to be healthy and have different kind of options in the table. And some kids are a little bit more picky with the food or struggle with food and like that, and that being part of this project and knowing that a lot of people is struggling with that and that we can change in some way for our kids, for our future, for this country or all the countries, that they can change that and the health can be better and even that improve another aspects of their life. That was amazing. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank you because it was so nice to be part of that and that you take us in account with that.
Oh, thank you so much. That's wonderful, Jocelyn. Thank you very much. Amanda, do you do you have anything you want to share?
Yeah, I just wanted to share that just being part of the project for me, and hopefully, I've got a big family. So hopefully if we can just change some of the Scottish Government's ideas on how people live. I think we ate a lot of snacks in my family. And I think that's how most of us live. And it was just that honesty of other people saying, I eat the same amount, or, like I don't eat like that. But it would just be good if we can change anything that helps families. Like obviously they changed the that's not universal credit, but the extra £300 a month if you have more kids and stuff. That's been a huge difference, for a lot of people. And so that's been good. But just to keep it going and to just make it so we can just have not the food you totally want. I mean, I'm not having salmon every night for my tea, but just to have good food. And one of my examples was just to have stuff in the freezer as well. If your kids' friends come round and they say, oh, I don't like what you're cooking. And you're like, oh, well, I've got an option here. Like I've got pizzas or I've got chicken nuggets, and just to have, enough money to help kind of out a bit more.
Yeah, and it's
It
those
makes a
examples.
difference to lots of families.
It was those examples, wasn't it? That we sort of really were able to tease out because we were working together over so much time to sort of say, oh, actually, we've forgotten about that time when your kids' friends come around.
Yeah,
and just this week that happened to me, and they were too picky and they wouldn't eat the thing that my kids normally would, and I had to go find something that they would eat. That was the example, wasn't it? And it was just, so you'll see in the full shopping list, there's a whole section there about unexpected times and food you would need to have for guests, and it's from the very detailed conversations about what it's like to really live in our lives, right?
Including birthday and Christmases and things like that, when you need extra, but it's not included maybe.
Do you remember anything about our birthday conversations? Because those were some of the most contentious. I felt like there were people that were thinking the family might need, this much budget because there's so much pressure on people. And then some people were thinking, no, you just make your own cake and that's all fine. And so there was quite a lot of negotiation around the birthdays in particular. Or is there anything else where you thought, gosh, we really spent a lot of time thinking about that one?
I think it highlighted for me it was the fruit and veg, the conversations on fruit and veg and how much fruit and veg, we should be eating versus what we were eating. And then the in between, it was it's especially, you must have been for a single family, but if you had bought a pack of mushrooms, you're not going to use a whole pack of mushrooms. And it was all the waste and what we would do with the waste, and the pepper debate, obviously, for the wasting. So maybe if we had less fruit and veg, even in massive packets, we could pick individual items or things like that, rather than almost back to the greengrocers, rather than bulk buying might be a better way as well to go in the future.
Because we thought quite a lot about not just kind of direct financial funds, but what the whole food environment could be doing. We all need to be working together towards a Scotland where the right to food is realized. So there are all sorts of different ways that we might be able to support families as well. Jocelyn, was there something else that you had? There were a lot of fruit and veg conversations in our group as well, weren't there?
Yes, well, that's something. I am from Costa Rica, and we coming from what we have in the garden rather than just going by and using a lot of packages and like that. So for me, it's very important that my kids grow in that way. And sometimes it's difficult because the diet here is different. So once that I introduce the kids to my diet, the diet from my country, they love that. But then they see the other stuff, like why my daughter, she asked me why I all the time bring fruits and the other kids bring snacks, different, packages and like that. And I like, well, that we do and stuff like that. It's a little bit of pressure there. For me as a mom, well, for all the moms, all the families and like that. But I think stuff like this make people more conscious. And even now the social media is better. Like you just go like, what I can do with these vegetables left. And then you go, what I can do, and then just make a soup. And the kids don't even realize they're in the soup, and just put a piece of bread and they're having the vegetables there in any way. Like, I think just now is a lot of stuff that we can make to improve that. We have it there. We just have to get more people engaged and the kids to try a little bit more. We were talking about that in another project that we have, but definitely see the opinion of all the moms in this project and like that. made me think I know by myself in this, and then that we can improve a lot of stuff.
So just one more question then. Do you think through all of our negotiations and all the challenges that we brought to the table from some of our steering groups, asking you to think a little bit more about, their fiber or their fruit and veg or something like that, do you think we ended up with realistic lists? Do you remember at the end when we looked at all of it and we thought, does this, would a family actually be okay using this list? Do you think we were too aspirational, or do you think we did all right?
Well, in my point of view, I think it was very realistic, because obviously what I do in my house is not the same that the other person do. But then like you come around like, oh yeah, we can change something here. We can do like a mix, because sometimes it's unrealistic. Like as a single mom, I am just myself and my 2 kids. And that obviously make the menu smaller, or the taking of, like you said, like maybe we buy a packet of something and the kids doesn't really want to try that. But then someone else mentioned a recipe or something different, the way that they do, so we can do the mix on that. It's totally realistic. I think it's been an amazing job, and see everything together is unbelievable.
Amanda, do you think we hit in a realistic mix?
I think we were slightly aspirational. I still think 30% of your budget on food is too much. I think the shopping list cost too much, but it was what we needed to buy. I think that shows that we don't have access to food. I think that showed that there isn't enough money for what people need. I also think now with the cost of living and what, like, I know my power bill and stuff is, I just don't think people could afford what we have on the lists.
Yeah, but the lists themselves, you think?
I think the lists were
they
good.
the
Yeah, they were exactly how they should be. Yeah, I think
it
they
was
had a mix of
such a shock to see how much they would have cost. wasn't
yeah.
it?
So I think people have to then cut corners, and you maybe don't eat quite as well as you should. Like for me, it was always the fruit and veg that ends up kind of getting dropped. Because I know my kids, I can't buy stuff that they're going to waste necessarily when I know they'll eat other stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And you saw how they went more, the
Yeah,
fruit
and
and
you
veg
have to
went
make
up
those
even more
choices,
this
and I think
past year.
that's what a lot of people have to make, that choice between something they will eat and something you would like them to eat, but they possibly won't.
Yeah,
Um,
great. Well, thank you so very much for sharing a bit about what the journey has been. I really appreciate both of your contributions today. And as I say, there are other community advisors in amongst the room today, so feel free to chat to them as well, and 1 or 2 who might be joining us online. If you see them in your breakout rooms, that would be great. So now you have an opportunity to go back onto Menti, or if you are in the room with us, you can raise your hand, and Irina will come around with a microphone. Oh, the microphone that's right here. And this is your opportunity to ask any questions about what you've heard from us so far this morning. So just a couple of minutes while we talk through. And I think Steph is going to let me know if anything comes up in the Menti. Brilliant. And if there are no questions, then that's brilliant. And I'll just pack up and go home. There's one.
See, when you did it, Chelsea, did you take special diets into consideration?
That's a really good question, Caroline. So we did not take special diets into consideration in the context of the families that we were working with. And of course, what that means is that anybody who is gluten intolerant, lactose intolerant, had some sort of, anything that would require any dietary restrictions or particular preferences would almost certainly add to the cost of the list. So it's worth just taking that into consideration for all of you who are looking at that. We wanted to make sure that we were creating, in this phase of the project at least, a diet that was at sort of most people in Scotland could eat. And of course, what that means is that we've missed out the additional costs on dietary restrictions, either for religious or for medical reasons. Thank you for that clarification. Can you just ask? Can you just ask it? Sorry. Oh, there's one just here while you get closer.
Hi, hello. Just a question about the 2 groups you're looking at there, the 2 families. So what percentage of the population does that cover?
That's a great question that I don't have the answer to. The question was, what percentage of the population are living in those family types?
Yeah,
And
because I'm thinking about, surely there must be a high percentage of people who are either living as a couple, just a couple, or even just a single person. Because I find an issue for single people living on their own is pack size and price as well.
absolutely. Okay, so these are really good points about the additional challenges and considerations that a single person living on their own without any children living in their house might face, or a couple, and how every single one of these diets would face their own particular circumstances and their own particular challenges. And as you'll see, as we get a little bit further down the line, our recommendations for moving forward from this work and taking the work forward is to expand the types of households that we explore, and go into a lot of detail on different types of households. And so perhaps a household where there is somebody with a disability living in it, or an older person that lives there either alone or with a partner, migrant Muslim family that's maybe subject to no recourse to public funds, for example. So every household type will face its own particular challenges, have its own circumstances, and all of that would need to be fleshed out with people, from our perspective, with people who know what it's like to shop for, prepare, and eat food in that household, so that we're informing the lists from people who know what the reality is. So
my question you've kind of already answered it. I wanted to ask about how it intersects at other social groups, because obviously a family, you don't always just eat with a family. You might have a grandparent, or as you mentioned, like a child's friend. And I haven't had a chance to read the whole report yet, but have you considered that? And those groups that maybe do this less frequent, but there are patterns of interaction between other social groups, for instance an older person who might be a grandparent or something like that, and is that considered? Because obviously there's so many impacts there to both social groups.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a similar response, in that what we were exploring was the lives of these particular household types. Things about grandparents came up quite a lot, because of course sometimes people share caring responsibilities. Sometimes you're over at Granny's house for a Sunday lunch. So do we build that into the costs of the family that we're working on, or do we just assume that we can rely on Granny to feed us on a Sunday? All of those kinds of things definitely came up. But the focus of the work for the 4 families that we were working on was just those particular household types. But is that okay? Does that answer your question? Yeah, great. Steph's got one from the online space.
We've actually had a few coming in from the online space, which is fantastic. But to start us off, how are the community advisors supported to be part of this and give their time?
I might need a little bit more of detail on that question, but the community advisors joined us in online meetings, so there weren't any travel costs or anything like that. They were reimbursed for attending, but it was sort of more, we were doing it as in a collaborative kind of way.
Great. Okay. How was the cost of food preparation factored into the shopping list?
Great question. So the cost of food preparation, this is almost definitely coming from a perspective of what additional costs would we need to build in terms of the fuel for, preparing the meals. We did not add that to the cost of the food budget itself, in the same way that we didn't add the transport costs for going and sourcing the food and bringing it back. So those would just need to be considered as additional costs to what we've presented here. And it's just worth noting, when we think about those figures around the 32%, obviously that would put a crunch on other aspects of a family budget, such as transport, the car ownership, fuel costs, all of these additional things. So it's not factored into the total cost that we have presented in the report.
Excellent. That's great, because we've had a couple more questions asking specifically about the cost of transportation being factored in. Also a question about, did anything come up about the access to shops with decent food? I have a very expensive SPAR, but no supermarkets close to me either. So I think that's the point you've just raised there about geographical access.
Yeah, so the very specific point about transport is that transport costs are not built into the cost of the list that you'll see presented in the report. And the wider issue around whether we have geographic access to the items on the list is a multi-staged answer. One is that we were preparing a list that we tried to imagine most people in Scotland would be able to access. So we didn't want to include things that were very specific, like a particular local vegetable that you wouldn't be able to get in most parts of Scotland. And this was just about trying to create a realistic list that we could go ahead and measure. And what you can now do with the list, though, is go and try and find those things in your local area. So we've been doing some work with the help of and support from the Scottish Government and the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, who've been supporting the whole project throughout, to explore the local availability and price of the items on the list. So in particular, we've been looking at the fruit and vegetable section of the Robinson family, and they're one of the large families. So it gave us 17 different types of fruits and vegetables that the Robinsons would expect to eat across a week. And we've been working with volunteer community researchers to go and explore what that would look like in their local area. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that and what we're planning for the next phase of that going forward. But of course, there is going to be variation in the additional transport costs that need to be layered in depending on where you're trying to access the foods that are on the list.
There was also a question about, has any consideration been given for international students mentioned here specifically and refugees whilst mapping nutrition levels, they've said, but.
Ooh, I'm afraid I'm going to need a little bit more context on that question. So if that was somebody in the room, please find me during the break. If it was somebody online, feel free to send it to us by email. My sense is that probably not, because they wouldn't have appeared in the case study families that we're exploring in detail. But if I haven't answered your question, please feel free to follow up with us afterwards. We've got time for maybe one or two more. Does anybody else in the room have one? There's a question on this side. Thank you so much for all the contributions to the questions. We're keeping a note of all of those things. And if there's anything that we haven't explored, as I mentioned, please do give us an email afterwards. Yes, please.
You may have answered this, but again, there's a question of seasonality, and which came into my mind when you said 17 fruits and vegetables. And I said, well, okay, but I don't expect to get strawberries in June, or do I?
I suppose you could expect to get strawberries in June, but
or in December.
Not in December. Yes, good question. So seasonality is one of the things that we would love to explore in a little bit more detail in the next phase of the work. It is, yeah, it's sort of in there a little bit in that we sort of acknowledge that people wouldn't necessarily want to eat lentil soup every single week of the year. But for the most part, it's an additional layer, both around seasonality. There's also other questions around sustainability and packaging and all of these kinds of things that we would love to explore alongside community advisors who can really give us a sense of what is reasonable and realistic for people living in Scotland today. So thank you for the question. It's absolutely really important. It's sort of not as well reflected in this round of the work as we would have liked to, but this was we were trialing some methods and trying to really work it out together. One more question from the Menti room.
So there was a question on what were the core prices based on? Top 4 supermarkets, or did you factor in small local shop prices?
Brilliant question and really good opportunity for me to clarify. So all of the prices that you see in the report are from Tesco Online. So we know that not everybody shops at Tesco Online. This is not an assumption about people's shopping practices. What it is a clear and consistent method for us to be able to track the prices at the same place over time. So we weren't screening the top 4. We were just looking at Tesco Online because it was agreed by the community advisors, also replicates the approach that's used by the minimum income standard work. And it still remains the sort of biggest retailer that most people are able to get the most things at. So it's all from Tesco Online. That's where the prices come from. Yep.
So it's a clarification question, and it says, would it be right to say that this is not an exercise in how to eat on a budget, but rather to see how much a good diet would cost in Scotland today?
What a brilliant question. That is, yes. That would be right. Congratulations, whoever managed to summarize everything I've been trying to say into one quick, snappy bit. That is correct. These are not instructions for how to live on a budget. They're not instructions to individual people about what a healthy diet is. They're not instructions for us in terms of behavior change. They are tools for us to use to monitor and understand how much it currently costs to eat the kinds of diets that people think would match well with our shared aspirations around health, enjoyment, and living our lives in today's Scotland. And so thank you for that opportunity to clarify. Brilliant. Is that okay? Okay, excellent. Thank you so very much for the questions. I really appreciate it. I'm just going, some of them appeared a little bit already in our kind of what our next steps are, but this is actually the slide that tells the story about these not being tools for individuals, but tools for national and local action. So this is a tool, the shopping lists have become a set of tools that help us understand what is happening currently with the cost and how this is changing over time, how this compares to our current average family incomes of people living in Scotland today. And of course, we could go into a little bit more detail there about different income scenarios for different groups and families. We also, if we went back to the groups or back to other groups in a year's time or 2 years' time or 5 years' time, we might find that some of the items on the list might change. So for example, we might have, so one of the groups, for example, was quite clear that they wanted to have a meat-free Monday. We might find that all 4 groups want a meat-free Monday if we went back to them in 5 years. It could be that, you know, our patterns and our aspirations around healthy eating are likely to change over time, and what's realistic in terms of the context of our lives is likely to change over time. So we can sort of use them as an opportunity to explore what people find realistic about what the right to food means for us. In terms of local action, this is something we'll explore after the break as well, but it's about using them as tools to be able to do that detailed work of, are these foods available in my local community? And if so, how much do they cost here? How much do they cost in comparison to what we've gathered from Tesco Online or the national baseline? What additional costs are there around transport to be able to access those things? And what does that mean for local decision makers in terms of planning, in terms of transport, in terms of all the different ways that we might be hoping to support families to better access foods, you know, the foods that they would want and choose. So is it about additional discretionary funds that go into that community, or is it about a community transport link? Being able to use them as a tool for that kind of detailed consideration. So we are making recommendations that there would be a working group established that involves, that's very similar to our steering group, frankly, that involves civil society, Food Standards Scotland, the Scottish Government, and people who have the sort of knowledge and expertise and different perspectives to be able to feed in from, to answer the kinds of questions about what sorts of households are our biggest priority for us, where, you know, what are we going to do once we have the answers to some of the questions about what people would like to see in these diets. So we are recommending that we continue to monitor the list that we've already established. So we have a baseline already. So we might as well continue to monitor these, knowing that if we went back to them in 5 years and added a sustainability lens, we might end up with slightly different items on the list. But still, we've established a baseline, and we recommend that those are continued. And we're recommending that we expand this. Oh, yes. Expand this to additional households. So I mentioned a few of them already, and they're in the report as recommendations. So an older person living on their own or in a couple. It could be, as I said, a migrant Muslim family who's subject to no recourse to public funds or is within the asylum process and has very definite constraints on what their financial income would be or financial access would be. So additional households are absolutely part of the next step. And as I mentioned, we've been focusing on access to a healthy diet or what people understand to be adequate within the context of a healthy lens. But of course, there's this whole additional lens around our food and our food aspirations around sustainability, which we could layer into the discussions going forward. We would recommend that people regularly review the content, as I mentioned, and use that as an opportunity and use those final lists as a way to evaluate the effects that changes in direct support from new and existing mechanisms like the Scottish Child Payment Best Start foods, universal free school meals when that's extended even further, and school clothing grants. What are those policies, and how are those policies affecting the affordability of our of the list for the families that we're speaking to? So using the tools to measure progress over time. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Peter Fassendeher, who is going to join us and has offered to speak in place of the minister who unfortunately wasn't able to join us today. But Peter is the senior policy lead for diet and healthy weight. Are you okay with it?
Yes.
Excellent.
Thank you very much. Really pleased to be here. Obviously, on behalf of the minister, and following Chelsea and following someone from the UN as well. So I'm not sure where that puts me, but I'm Peter Fassendeher. I work in Scottish Government. I have a variety of different policy leads on community food, on out of home, so things like calorie labeling, which is obviously something a lot of people are talking about. And climate change is coming up as well. So a very wide range of different policies. Within that massive remit, we have this as well. We have human rights. We have the right to food, the right to eat healthier. So what I thought would be interesting to do would be to just to pull out a little bit, show you the highlights and lowlights of some of the things that are happening right now in terms of Scottish Government and what we're doing around policy, and then bring it back to the report and why we were really keen to support, to help fund the report, and also really keen to continue the work going forward. So this is the trickiest bit. Have I gone the wrong way? I've got the wrong technology. There we yeah, I mean, I guess one of the main aspects that we are focused on and have been for some time is when we're looking at improving diet is around tackling health inequalities. There are some very low lights up there from the most recent Scottish Health Survey, just confirm out how for children, obesity risk is double that in the most deprived areas, least deprived areas. We have set out our own policies. In 2018, we published the Diet and Healthy Weight Delivery Plan and set out a range of different things that we wanted to do to try and improve the nation's diet in advance of COVID and in advance of the cost of living crisis. So obviously, things have been held because of some of those things. I'll go on to talk about that. The thing to do is to look at how you can want to home in on people who are more vulnerable, people who need that support more, and we do that. But actually what we found is that making societal changes, systemic changes actually have the greatest impact. So for example, things like looking at advertising for TV and online, we actually know that those who are in the lower socioeconomic groups are more likely to be affected by that, and therefore more likely to benefit from that. So obviously, some of those powers are within Scottish Government and some of them are at the UK level. So we're very keen to see the UK Government push through on its commitments to start restricting some of that advertising of HFSS foods. There is some room for optimism. So where we do have powers, we are trying to advance things. So for example, one of the more positive aspects that we've seen recently is an increase in fruit and veg consumption for children. And we think that this is probably down to the change in school meal provision in Scotland. We don't know that for sure, but it does seem to coincide. The timing kind of works quite nicely with what's happened. So yeah, as I say, we're trying to kind of do all these various different things. So that's health inequalities. What about food insecurity? That's kind of coming back to this sort of area more. Well, oops, got to change this one as well. So we know that gone are the days where we within the Diet and Healthy Weight team, we could look at things purely in isolation. We now know that what we need to do is we need to look at things more holistically. So as well as dealing with the food industry, we need to look at the means by which people can eat a healthier diet. It's great for us policymakers to sit there and just go, okay, well, here are our dietary goals and here's what everybody should be doing. But I think, as one of the community advisors said, I really struck a chord with me, actually, was about how that's not the real world. And so what we need to do is we need to think about what is it that people can actually do, what are they able to do, and what do they want to do as well, which is again where this report comes in. So in terms of alleviating food insecurity, we need to look at the underlying causes. And of course, lately that's down to the sort of cost of living issues and food price inflation. We all know how much that's gone up. One of the interesting things I found in the report is how it's happened at an interesting time. Probably wish it wouldn't have happened at an interesting time, but actually it's really useful to look at and how that's affected the purchases and the behaviors. I think going forward, that's something that I think we want to build on. We haven't just stood by. We've tried to help where we've could, and great that the report acknowledges that. So we've obviously allocated almost 3 billion to help households face the increased cost of living. And then just last week, we announced an additional 2.4 million last week, which has gone to various different organizations to help further support people living with food insecurity. I think the last point on this slide is really important. We are completely committed as a government to a cash first and a human rights-based approach, which again is why this report is so important, because it kind of brings those things together. I would say that that's quite starkly different from some other parts of the UK. What we'd like to do is to see a less of a reliance on food handouts and more of a reliance to give people the means to be able to buy the food that they want and the food that they need. So I guess one of the things that this report has brought home for me is how it brings everything together. Michael from the UN mentioned about the Good Food Nation policy and how important that is. It's been a massive step for us as a government, having now to look at things much more holistically than ever before. I mentioned earlier to you about climate change. To be quite honest, until the last 18 months, we in the diet policy team hadn't really looked at climate change as much as we probably could have and should have. But that's now a core part of our work. So as well as looking at tackling poverty, public health, we are looking at climate change as well. We're going to have to start figuring that into everything else that we're doing. And that means that we need to consider the win-wins. So we need to look at things where we can affect both climate positively and public health positively. So again, it was mentioned earlier on about, I think again, Michael from the UN mentioned about, if you're eating meat, reducing that meat intake a little bit and increasing your fiber and your fruit and veg intake, better for you, better for the planet as well. But we need to make sure that that's done in a realistic way that again, this report captures. So coming back to Good Food Nation, we've obviously passed the bill's become an act, and we now have Good Food Nation plans, which will be taken forward. There's going to be a national Good Food Nation plan we publish for public consultation in the summer. So look out for that, and it'll be really good to get people's comments and views. So bringing it back down to the report, well, I think it's an excellent example of linking those food policies together. So it's a rights-based approach, linking nutrition, Good Food Nation, and local food. And we've got policies around all those areas, but it's bringing that together in a realistic way, starts to address what adequate food looks like. And I really mean that when I say start, I think, again, some of the questions that have been raised about different family types is really important, because what I would love to do is to carry on the work and to look at some of those other examples. You know, for instance, you know, a family that, say, a Muslim family, or different family units, maybe a rural family, whatever, that looks at food in different ways, as different challenges. So it puts together these core issues about affordability, knowledge, and dignity is an important point as well. We've probably not covered that quite as much yet, but maybe we'll hear more about that later on. And time, convenience, and choice. And considers how interventions and changing circumstances affect that choice. So I really welcome, I think, the Scottish Government and the Minister, who has seen the recommendations, welcomes those recommendations, and we would accept the recommendations as well. They set out useful next steps for further research, and we'd be keen to work with Nourish and others going forward. So that's all I've got to say. Questions or...
So much, Peter. If Peter's allowed us sort of a couple of minutes to ask some questions. If anybody has any questions, again, back on Menti, or I've got them in the room. Sorry, apologies for our online people. And I saw this person first. Sorry, my apologies.
Hi. Have you started to factor in the cost of fertilizer, and for cost of fertilizer, or the availability of fertilizer on the availability of food and the cost of food going forward, considering the situation in Russia?
Maybe we'll take two at a time.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll just.
Thank you so much. I work for Food Train and work closely with your team. I have a specific question around the Social Renewal Advisory Board was established by Scottish Government following the early stages of the pandemic, and it included a food access circle. And they had a series of recommendations, and I haven't heard anything about what's happening based on those recommendations going forward. And there's lots of crossover in things and themes that are coming out from here. And obviously that food access circle had lots of really key, crucial recommendations and lots of learning from the pandemic that we could take forward to future potential food system crises. You know, the war in Ukraine was a prime example of that. Can you give us an update on anything that's happening in relation to that? And no, you might not be able to say anything, and that's fine. I'm just wondering.
I got to be completely honest and say I can't, because I don't get involved in that piece of work, but I'll follow up with that with you. I'm more than happy to do that. In relation to your point, I would say that we are certainly, it's a combination of things. So the whole cost of living crisis is not just affecting families, is affecting businesses as well, and different types of food groups are affected by different things. So fertilizers is a really good example of that. And the war in Ukraine has obviously affected different types of food, but we actually see other pressures on the food system as well, which also have an impact on specific food items. For example, Brexit has had an effect. We know that the long hot summer that we had last year is likely to have an effect on certain products being more available than others or less available than others. So there are lots of different things that affect the system. And I'm really glad you brought it up, because again, in diet policy, we're looking at public health. We wouldn't normally have started to look at those sorts of things. We need to look at that now, because it's affecting the cost of what people can buy. And in fact, even what's on the shelves, because sometimes it just isn't there.
Thank you so much, Peter. I really appreciate you coming, stepping in for the minister who wasn't able to join us. Thank you so very much. It's a pleasure to be working with you. Okay, thank you, everybody. We are now, we've got a few more minutes. Sandy's gonna be mad at me for moving the mic. Is that okay? Okay, good. We have just a couple more minutes before we get started, before we go for break, actually at 2:15. So now you've been hearing a lot from the top of the room. Now is the opportunity to speak in your tables, and you'll be brought into breakout rooms as well. So we really wanted to ask or create the space for people to just do a little bit of reflecting. What is it that you've heard so far? Is there anything that strikes you? Anything you found particularly interesting, not useful? Something you might have been surprised about? It's just up until the break, something that has anything that's come up for you. Sorry. There we go. Any surprises, anything you've learned. So for those of you who are at physical tables, you don't need to be brought into breakout rooms. You can just speak to your neighbors. For those of you online, hopefully you'll be whizzed away into breakout rooms now, sort of 10 minutes. And then if you can be keeping an eye on the Menti as well and just pop in anything that comes up from your table that you think is particularly interesting, we'll look over those during the break and we'll have another little opportunity to reflect after that. So away you go. Have a nice chat. Now, we are really grateful to Luis, who is going to join us now to give us an update from the Scottish Human Rights Commission. Luis Llanes is an experienced expert in economic, social, and cultural rights, and he provides legal policy advice on these topics and supports the Commission's work on the National Task Force on Human Rights Leadership. And he's going to give us a little bit of an update about what's been happening in Scotland and what we can look forward to as opportunities around bringing human rights, and particularly economic, social, and cultural rights, a little bit closer to home. So, Luis, if you could join us. If you want your beautiful.
Thank you, Chelsea, and thank you, everyone. I should just in case, for those of us who don't know much about the Scottish Human Rights Commission, Scottish Human Rights Commission is an independent public body. So we're not part of Parliament, we're not part of government. We are funded by Parliament, where we're Scotland's national human rights institution, as mandated by the UN. So we are an independent body with its role to promote and protect human rights in Scotland. So a big chunk of our work and a big chunk of my work has been for the last few years to ensure that we have a substantial reform over legislation in Scotland to have a substantially stronger piece of protection over human rights in Scotland, and particularly over economic, social, and cultural rights in Scotland. So I'm going to very briefly talk about sort of Scotland's current human rights journey, and I'm going to talk about that sort of in 3 stages, using just a very simple, very beautiful, very simple picture of the 3 sisters in Glencoe. Ooh, we're not going to use it. But so let's just kind of imagine this journey in 3 stages and 3 different peaks. So we're currently, unfortunately, at the very first stage of that process, right? So what do we currently have in Scotland within the UK and within the devolved context? We have a protection of certain human rights. So we usually call them civil and political rights. So most of them protected under the Human Rights Act, although in danger, unfortunately. And that's a whole different other talk. But those rights are freedom of association, freedom of expression, freedom from torture. So usually the right to vote, the right to privacy, the right to family life, those are usually called civil and political rights. And sort of historically, there's a division of another certain group of rights, which we usually call economic, social, and cultural rights. And those rights include some worker rights, social rights, which includes food and housing and water and health and education, and then cultural rights as an umbrella term of various rights that include the right to participate in cultural life. So these rights don't exist protected within our legislation, right? So they are bound in certain international treaties, which the UK is bound to comply with. And so our messaging is always that, there we go. Our messaging is always that these rights should be complied by duty bearers, but they're not enforceable. So although duty bearers should currently operate in a way that is compatible with the rights, there is no legal redress for doing anything if they don't. So we can't go to court, we can't get a remedy, we can't enforce them through court, although again, they should be complied with because there's a treaty in which the UK has bound itself to comply with. So that's usually ICESCR, the UN International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and other treaties. I won't go in. So where are we at currently? We're in the sort of first peak, okay? There's some accomplishments done. So we currently have the Good Food Nation, which I won't go into detail, with a first step into the recognition of the right to food. And the very, very big step is we have a recognition from the Scottish Government, from different political parties, from the legal community in Scotland, that economic, social and cultural rights should be incorporated into Scots law. So they should not only be found in international law, but they should be brought into domestic legislation. And that has been a long process of around 10 years, which the Commission has been very active in trying to convince government, parliament, different political parties and the legal community of why it's important to incorporate that. Now, if anyone is into hiking and does a sort of long range in a type of mountain like this, you'll remember that you have to sometimes, you arrive to a peak and it's a long journey down and up again. And we're currently in that process of going up to the second peak. So where are we at? We're currently in the process after sort of several initiatives, such as the First Minister's Advisory Group on Human Rights Leadership, and then the National Task Force on Human Rights Leadership. There's a set of recommendations that have been set to the government, which they're currently being revised and worked on. So the idea is to incorporate a set of treaties that includes ICESCR. So I'm not going to go into detail with the rest, but within those, it would incorporate sort of the text in some way or the other of ICESCR. So that includes the right to an adequate standard of living, which inside of the right to an adequate standard of living includes the right to food. So we're waiting for a consultation. Unfortunately, that consultation has been delayed for almost a year, various reasons, because of staffing mostly, and the need to ensure that the consultation is good and that the policy sort of preparation for that is good. We've supported that process, but we're waiting for within the next sort of 4 or 5 months for a consultation to open. And for many of you, it will be really important to respond to that consultation because it will be sort of the foundation of what type of legislation is going to be introduced. After that, again, we're still in that sort of middle bit where we'll be waiting for the legislation to finally be introduced, which we hope will be either by the end of this year or at some point next year. The commitment is that it will be introduced by this Parliament session, but we hope that that is much sooner than the end of the Parliament session itself. So if it's introduced, hopefully that will be the case because the commitment is strong. We'll be in that second peak. And again, there's still a journey to go because that doesn't mean that everything is fixed, and that doesn't mean that the journey is over. Now, many of you know the right to food, as most economic, social and cultural rights, has, just to sort of reduce it in some way, has two very important components. To one degree, the right is to be progressively realized. So it means that the right can't be achieved overnight. There has to be measures implemented over time to ensure that it is improved. So the access to the right is improved, the quality of the right is improved, the affordability, in this case, the affordability of food is improved over time. And that's a real recognition that countries have limited resources. So you have to maximize your resources to progressively realize the right. There's a second component, which we often in jargon call minimum core obligations. And those are, there are certain components, certain obligations of the right that are of such importance that they shouldn't be progressively realized. Now, at the international stage, what we have is a very minimalistic understanding of that. And the intention of that is because the sort of UN committee is trying to ensure that there's a general standard across the world of what that is. But different countries can define their minimum core, that their immediate obligations, their non-negotiable obligations to the way they want. So you have examples of Colombia defining them in a specific way through the understanding of something called vital minimum, and Germany through a different understanding of what existentialist standard means. So there will be a process, and that has been the recommendation from the Commission and accepted by the government, of defining what those minimum entitlements will be, or those minimum obligations. So that could range very differently within the context of food, right? So would that be a minimum level of nutrition that you would have a right to access freely? Would that imply a level of affordability of food, of specific staples? So some countries, for example, have a percentage of how much you can profit over specific foods, right? So dairy is a quite common example of you can't profit above 15%. So there is a limitation. So there will be sort of that extra process in which the definition of minimum core would take, according at least of our recommendation, a participatory process, which will take the views of lived experience, policymakers, experts to define them. So this is that third peak, right? This is the process in which we would have to define what are the minimum titles. We would have to define what further guidance is needed to arrive to the final peak, which is when we have a very strong, complete set of protections. So the bill, we usually call it a framework bill. So the first step is incorporation, but you'll start having questions just as I mentioned, should there be further legislation which ensures how you limit the profitability of food, for example, what type of private actors and how they're able to operate, how is food supply and food chain. So there are all other areas of subsequent legislation and subsequent guidance that would be needed to interpret the right to food. If you use just the text of the international treaty, you'll see that it just basically says there's a right to an adequate standard of living that includes the right to food. That's it. So the special rapporteur, we heard this morning, providing some aspects of the interpretation of what the right to food is. So affordability, accessibility, sustainability, cultural adequacy, for example. Now, those are not in law. Those are not in the text. So it will be up to Scotland in that third peak to be able to define them in law. So do we want legislation or statutory guidance to very clearly say that that the right to food includes an element of affordability, and what are the consequences of that affordability? That it implies to be accessible, and therefore, if you have to drive 50 miles away to access food, then there is a breach of the right to food. So that is still part of what that will come. So again, very encouraging process, but one that we're just only starting effectively. And it will be really within the next 3 to 8, 10 years in which we'll finally reach the final peak of sort of strong protection in legislation. Now, afterwards comes the process of implementation, which is critical, because the point of the legislation is to ensure that duty bearers do comply and do operate in a way that is compatible with human rights, but that level of implementation can vary. Depending on different things, including resources. So civil society put together and different institutions like ourselves would be critical in really sort of monitoring and ensuring that the right to food is adequately realized in Scotland. I'll leave it there. I think that gives a general overview, but I'm happy to answer any questions now or in person later if that's needed. Thank you.
Thank you so very much.
No, it's my pleasure.
Thank you, Luis. If only I could speak so well to one picture, that would make it a lot easier for me to make my slideshows. Brilliant. That was really helpful context, I think, and really important update on where we are in Scotland. There are a lot of opportunities coming down the track for us in Scotland to be thinking about how we're going to define the right to food, what that looks like here, and how we're going to make sure that it's implemented and realizable for everybody here. As Luis was talking about, some of that will happen over time and be progressively realized. And some of that is about articulating and defining what it is that we mean as the minimum core responsibility and obligation. What's our baseline that we're not going to fall below? And that's part of the work that we've been doing here together with community advisors over the past couple of years and with the help of policy experts who've been feeding in, trying to help us define actually what is it that we mean by the right to food so that we understand how we can implement those things going forward. So it's a really helpful context. Thanks so very much. And it's an exciting opportunity and time in Scotland at the moment. So we know that that is one area of work that is absolutely ripe for our input and discussion, and participation will be a huge part of taking that work forward. So the other one other bit to this story is about how we do this at a local level. So you know that we've been doing some work to track the pricing. We've talked about that so far already. We know that we have already identified what the content of the right to food for these particular families might look like, examples of this and what that might look like, and how much that costs and how that relates to families' incomes at the moment. So that's one of the ways we're using the tools that we've been developing at a national level, inform some of those conversations. We've also, as I mentioned previously, been doing some work with volunteer community researchers at local levels in lots of different parts of Scotland, and to explore whether the actual foods, the fruit and vegetables, the specific fruits and vegetables that the Robinsons might eat in a week are available in their local shops, and if so, what the cost is of those. We've got a report on our website from the work that took place over the summer, where you can see that, of course, there are price variations, and of course, there are fluctuations in whether some of these items are available in different areas. And what we're doing now is teasing that out in a little bit more detail, looking at the particularities around rural areas, for example. Some of the volunteers have been based in Dumfries and Galloway. I think a few of you are here joining us today, and some in Highland, where we explored one whole area of the Highland area to just figure out, were there any changes or variations or differences in the availability or prices when we looked at places that might have longer to go or further journeys to make in order to access the foods in the shops. We've got Alex here today who's made an epic journey from Uist to join us because we're taking this work forward in Uist and Barra just starting next week. Getting our community researchers started there. We're going to try and hit every single shop in Uist and Barra over the course of a couple of weeks so that we can just see over this period, in this period of time, if you wanted to buy these 17 items, what would it look like? Where would you have to go? And how much would that cost? For people that are living on these islands. And if we find that the food isn't there, then we're going to have a really interesting conversation. And if we find that the food is there, but it took a really long time for people to get from one shop to the next to be able to meet all of the needs of the Robinsons over the course of those 2 weeks, then we've got another conversation to have about whether that's a transport thing. So we're headed towards a right to food dialogue at the end or at the start of March, but we're doing some preparatory work together with local researchers, with local volunteers, to get ahead of our conversation together with all of the people that might be involved in a food system discussion, and say, okay, but here's what it looks like right now in our local area. What are we going to do about this? What does this information help us how does this help us to have the conversation about the right to food here? So what we're going to do with the rest of the time we've got today is put you back into your tables for those of you in the room, breakout rooms for those of you online. And the first thing I want you to do is think about whether, yes, I've mentioned that already, whether you are a group of people who are more interested in the national conversation, or whether you're a group of people who are more interested in the local conversation. We've got people who are here from lots of different areas of government, of universities, of community groups, of civil society. I'm not sure who's in your mix of table today, but just have a bit of a chat. Do you want to, is it more relevant or interesting to you to be talking about local or national? And then just have a bit of a think. What are the opportunities that we have available to do this work, to apply this approach? Or what are the things anything that you were inspired by from the work that Luis was talking about how we might be defining and thinking about the right to food? Anything that's come up from our conversation so far today that sparked your imagination or your conversation? So we've given you some questions here. It's really just, you've got about 20 minutes to talk as a table, and then we'll do a bit of reflection afterwards as well. How do we take this work forward? we've put a lot of effort into getting to a point where we've got a report. There's so much information in this report, and not just the summary report that you've got on your tables today, but 2 other reports that are online as well. There's so much detail and data here and information that we've got and signals to us about what might be included in the right to food, what that might look like in practice, what that might entail. So how do we take some of that information and apply it in our local areas or at a national level? And so we're just interested in what you can come up with. So it's your chance to be creative, and you've got about 20 minutes, and we'll give you a bit of a warning when you come back. Over to Pete.
Thank you. Thanks, Chelsea. And as you know, I came in late. I was working with some of Peter's colleagues on another bit of the right to food, which is how do we support farmers to transition towards climate and nature friendly farming, which is another part. How do we make food sustainable going into the future and something which is good for all of us? So I'm just going to got the job of taking some questions, comments, final thoughts from you, saying a few words before Chelsea wraps up. So don't let me down, please, or I'll have to make things up. Who's got a question or a comment or a thought? We'll take a couple from the room, then we'll take something from online. Don't be shy. Sure.
We were talking about how to take this forward, Peter, and we had a discussion, which we put as a question to you, is that it's a kind of thing about the role of Nourish and the role of institutionalize this kind of further research. I mean, is it your job to go on providing all this information terribly usefully to the Scottish government, or shouldn't this really be part of some bigger story? And we had quite a lot of discussion about that.
Yeah, what a great question. And I think what I heard from Peter when I came in first was that, you know, the minister and the civil servant team are very minded to accept the recommendation about taking the work forward in some way. And I think that's great. The more we've thought about it, the more we think yes, it absolutely needs to be institutionalized in the sense that it needs to be brought into mainstream of conversations, as Louise was saying about, well, how do we measure the right to food? How do we implement it? How do we get to that third peak that we've talked about? But I was thinking about that, and you know, everybody in this room, I mean, you wouldn't be here if you weren't interested, but as well as being interested, has access to people and communities and places which are different and which have different views about, you know, what's adequate food, what's a good diet, what's a good way of getting through the week with food for our particular neighborhood, for our particular family, you know, for our particular street. And people, that richness is hugely, hugely important here. Because as we try to find a way of measuring the right to food, it's really important we don't boil it down into a sort of pureed soup, because that's not what it's about. You know, it's much more like an orchestra. It's much more like lots of different strands that are all important, actually working together to say, no, that's what we mean by the right to food. So I suppose I want to say to you is, yes, absolutely, Nourish wants to be involved in this. We're going to need some resources ourselves to keep doing work on it. We're looking for those, but we also need the contribution of people in this room and beyond to say, we want to work with you on this. We've got some ideas. We know some families, we know some streets, we know some organizations who want to be involved in this. We certainly can't do it on our own. And up till now, the community advisors have been crucial, the steering group's been crucial, the local work's been crucial. This is about co-production. It's about doing something together. And it's just an invitation really to say, if people want to work with us on the next stage, please do keep in touch, and we'll try and figure out a way that all of us can make this. Thank you. More questions? I won't answer as long the next one. I was going to say that anyway, but it was great prompt. Thank you.
Hello, I'm representing Tagsa Uist that is based up in the Western Isles in South Uist, and I suppose I'm really particularly curious about local food chains and local food infrastructure and what support mechanisms can be put in place to create basically a level playing field, because in the island communities, they're suffering all very similar problems throughout Scotland as other communities are, but then compounding that, they are suffering the disruptions of transport disruptions on the Calmac ferry. So basically all our goods are coming on a Calmac ferry. And how do you power up communities to create to solve these food insecurity issues that they're facing currently?
Again, that's a really good question. And Michael, who spoke to you earlier, Michael Thackeray, when he's not talking about the right food, talks a lot about trade, and he talks about a lot about local food economies and how the way we set up the agricultural trading system has really undermined the capacity of local communities to manage their own food systems. And US 100, 200 years ago, okay, it might have been a very basic diet, but there'd have been a huge amount of local control over the food system, and families would have had their barrel herrings or their bag of grain, or they would have had some sense of they're in control of what they put in their mouths, and they're in control of how it works. And in a bad year, it's tough, but that sense of control is really, really important. I think, and this isn't something we can solve in the short term, but I think the opportunities, Peter said, of the Good Food Nation Act and the plans means that it is up to local communities to come together and make their Good Food Nation plan and say, look, what we want on our island is much more local production. I was in Iceland just before Christmas, where they grow pretty much all their own tomatoes, they grow all their own cucumbers, make their own peppers. Okay, they have a lot of hot water underground, but we have a lot of renewable energy above the ground too. So there's lots of opportunities, I think, to strengthen local food economies, but also this thing about creating more jobs locally, creating more processing locally, paying each other to help us live and eat well, and I think there's a real mileage in there. With the Islands Bill and the Islands obligation in Scotland, there are real policy opportunities, I think, to use the Good Food Nation plan to say, how can we do food really well on our islands and tackle the sort of the islands premium that comes with, food. It's not fresh and it's very expensive and there's not a lot of choice. And I think the island communities are so resilient, they could crack this, but they need to be given permission and support to crack it. Tilly.
So you talked a lot about the role of the community advisors in this work, and obviously the effectiveness and success of the Good Food Nation Act. I've been calling it a bill for so long, every time I say it after me, will obviously be dependent on people being able to be engaged with that process. How do you think that should be? And where do you think we obviously need to shift the power to community level and get so many different people involved in that? As is shown in this project, how successful that has been in this research. Do you have any general thoughts on that power shift?
Wow.
Or how that can be done?
Yeah. I mean, I do think it's a challenge. It's a challenge. Vivian, who was here earlier on from Edinburgh, is trying to put a food plan together for Edinburgh. That means trying to engage a lot of people in making it their food plan, not the council's food plan. And similarly, for the national food plan, it has to be not the Scottish government's food plan, but Scotland's food plan. And that building up of participation in the processes, we're not going to get it perfect first time, by any means. But I think what was lovely about this project was that it wasn't just that people brought their opinions to the table, they brought their deep knowledge, of what it takes to get through the week on food with a young family, and do all the other things you have to do. And getting that knowledge of people's own circumstances into the process is hugely important. I don't know how we do it at scale, but it will depend a lot on local organizations bringing, working with the people that they support and trying to tap into that knowledge, and starting from working out what works for you, what would make a difference for you, and we've got a couple of 4 case study families now, and we're trying to figure out what would work for them. We need a wider variety of families, wider variety of households, but keep digging into that thing about what would help you get through the week better with food. And we will generate a richness of ideas, I think, that can then feed into both local and national food plans. So I really hope we can keep that aspect of the work going. That's what we got.
Great. Thanks, Pete. We've had quite a few comments and responses from the online, people joining us from online. One of the ones that has come up quite a few times is people saying that they really like the approach of starting where people are at. And I think that's been mentioned 3 or 4 times. So pleased that people have found value of that in the project. There have also been quite a few people raising the concerns around local access to food and how food money is being spent instead of on healthy options, looking at money being spent more towards transport and how that was a real drain of finances. So that comment's been made a few times too. So I was just saying just now that lots of people have found value in starting where people are at, rather, which is part of, obviously, a core part of this project as a whole. Sorry, I'm just repeating for the people who are in the room so they can hear us from across the space as well. There's also been a few suggestions from the online community about who else needs to be involved in the project moving forward. So there have been mentions of asylum seekers and immigrants, especially for the culturally appropriate food. There's also been mention of involving disabled people for the importance of ensuring that there's a better understanding of access and accessibility. Also a suggestion to involve more people with the public health and nutritional needs to be involved in the consistent messaging behind the project as well. And then another suggestion about how we can expand the project, perhaps to include the affordability of organic foods moving forward too. And I think that's more or less sort of the key points that have come through that a few people have mentioned. There are other specific questions too, but we won't have a chance to get through all of them just now.
Great. No, I think that's great. I mean, you alluded to that, Peter, as well, but the whole basis of the project was trying to start with people's everyday lived experience and their thoughts about that and their reflections on that, because we know that we can't, even on a democratic state, it's really, really hard to change what people do when it comes to food, right? People have very strong beliefs about what's important to them, what's important to their family, what's important to their culture, and we can't mandate that people are going to suddenly eat differently or eat in the way that we think they should eat that's good for them, and I think to some extent we all struggle with this in diet and healthy weight policy or in sustainability policy. People say, oh, people ought to eat this, people ought to eat that, and at the end of the day you do get an awful lot of people just resisting that and going, who are you to tell me what I put in my mouth and how I look after my body? People need to have agency over that. I was thinking earlier, you said, Luis, about going up these mountains, and sorting out the sort of human rights picture in Scotland. And it's really important to understand that Luis or even Michael Fakhri are not going to go up the mountain for us and tell us what's up there and bring the 10 commandments down. We actually have to go up the mountain together, and we have to start together to say, what do we need to do collectively to make things change? And I think too often we end up in these conversations with a bit of them and us. It's not us that have the problem, it's them that have the problem. They need to do something differently. So the whole ethos of this project is starting with where people are, listening to what they have to say and helping them figure out what are better ways for them of getting through the week with food. I'd love to talk about organic food and the availability of that, because again, I don't think it came up so much from what Michael said just now, but this whole issue about long-term sustainability of the planet is also part of the right to food. I mean, it has in there the germs of this issue about sustainability in future generations. And what we know is that if we don't get it right with climate and nature, it's not just people in other parts of the world whose right to food is compromised. Our right to food is also compromised. The Ukraine war has been a warning, COVID's been a warning. We've had lots of extreme weather events. We can see the depletion of nature. We can see that if we don't get it right for climate and nature, maybe we won't suffer, but our kids certainly will. And our grandchildren will certainly suffer, because we've got to make a planet that can produce food reliably, safely. And we also owe it to nature to leave our kids a planet that's full of nature. So I think, organic food isn't the only answer to that, but we have to be thinking about food not just being healthy, not just being tasty, not just fitting with our own lives, not just being, something we enjoy, but also something that keeps the planet going as well as us. That's great. Thank you.
I think that's a really nice place to end that bit of the conversation. And thank you so much to everybody for taking the time to join us in this journey today. You can find more information online, and I hope you will. We've got now, so the summary report that you've seen today, but we've also got a much more detailed full report, the pink one. And then another one that describes the way that we went about this and the methods and the approach that we took. So if you're curious about any of the detail, or if you want just a good read, all of those things are available online on our website. I want to now just take the time to say thank you to everybody who has been a part of getting us to this point in the day. First of all, everybody who's joined us here today and online. It's been really nice to see the interest and the engagement with the project at this stage. It's been really lovely to be able to share some of what we've been learning with people who are obviously coming from so many different perspectives and different parts of this system. And as Pete mentioned, we need everybody to be involved in the next steps of it as well. So thank you so much for coming and attending. Thank you to our tech team, Sandy and Kyle and Anna, who've been keeping both of the rooms in touch with each other throughout. It's been really nice to be able to involve people who weren't able to join us in Edinburgh today, but lovely to see those of you who were able to join us. Thank you so very much to all of the community advisors. So there are many more of them working their lives, doing the things that they do every day. And some of them were able to join us here today. And we're just so appreciative of the time and the care and the attention and the passion that you put into all of the conversations that we had last year that formed the basis of this. So again, there's plenty of information from those discussions in the full report, and I really encourage you to read through some of the detail from that. And thank you also to the steering group members who have been with us throughout the whole of the journey. Your advice, your challenges, your questions, your sort of concerns and just support throughout has been really welcomed, and we wouldn't have been able to get here without you. Thank you to all the community researchers who are volunteers who are out doing the current phase and the next phase of the work, trying to understand a little bit more about what the availability and prices look like in local areas. And of course, thank you to our funders, Scottish Government and the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, who's been supporting the whole project. So that's us for today. I really appreciate everybody coming along, and have a nice afternoon.